At my sister's wedding, my mother stood up and pointed at my daughter, screaming, "She's a liar and a disgrace." The room fell silent. But then, my daughter pulled out her phone, pressed play, and the entire hall heard my mother's secret conversation, a secret so dark that my father stumbled back, whispering, "Tell me this isn't true." I used to believe that weddings were about love, joy, and new beginnings. That was before my sister's wedding, before my mother's voice shattered the reception hall, before my father stumbled back in horror, before my daughter exposed the truth that had been festering beneath our family's perfect facade for decades. That night, everything I thought I knew about my family crumbled. Bellevue Manor was breathtaking that evening. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the ballroom, the scent of roses and eucalyptus drifting from the elaborate floral arrangements at every table. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the Charleston sky in hues of orange and pink. It was the kind of evening people dream of, perfect in every way. Except it wasn't. I sat at one of the round tables, absent-mindedly swirling the champagne in my glass, my stomach tight with unease. The laughter, the clinking of silverware, the upbeat melody of the string quartet, it was all just noise to me. My daughter, Sienna, sat beside me, her posture stiff, her fingers drumming lightly against the side of her phone. She wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just watching. She had been tense all evening. I noticed it when we arrived, the way she kept glancing toward my mother. I had assumed it was just the usual discomfort. Sienna and my mother had never been close. But now, sitting here, I could feel something heavier in the air. I leaned over and whispered, "Are you okay?" She gave a small nod but didn't meet my eyes. Something was wrong. Across the room, my mother, Diane, was laughing with some of the guests, effortlessly charming as always. She was wearing an elegant emerald green gown, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves, her diamond earrings catching the light every time she turned her head. To anyone else, she was the picture of grace and poise, a woman who had built the perfect life, the perfect family. But I knew her better. I had spent my entire life being molded, corrected, criticized. Diane didn't raise children, she sculpted them, refined them like expensive china, making sure there were no cracks, no flaws. I had never been quite right in her eyes, never elegant enough, never obedient enough, never quite the daughter she wanted. Sienna saw through her too, even at a young age. And because of that, my mother had never been fond of her either. A waiter passed by, refilling my champagne, and I took a small sip, trying to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. Then Diane approached our table. Her smile was wide, but her eyes were sharp as they flickered between me and Sienna. "Caroline," she said, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder. "Isn't this just the most beautiful evening? Evelyn looks stunning, doesn't she?" I nodded. "She does. And you, Sienna," she continued, turning to my daughter. "You look lovely tonight." There was something in her tone, polite, but just barely. Sienna didn't respond right away, just stared at her grandmother with an expression I couldn't quite place. Diane's smile faltered, just for a second, before she recovered. "Well, I do hope you're enjoying yourself." She walked off before either of us could reply. Sienna exhaled slowly, pressing her lips together. "Sienna," I said carefully, "what's going on?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I saw hesitation. But before she could say anything, the music shifted, and it was time for the speeches. Evelyn's new husband, Mark, stood first, thanking everyone for coming, sharing a few heartfelt words about his new wife. Then it was my father's turn. Thomas, a quiet but steady man, gave a short but sweet toast about love and commitment. Then the microphone was passed to Diane. She stood gracefully, lifting her glass, smiling at the crowd. And then, just as she was about to speak, she turned, her gaze locking on to Sienna. And then, with a voice loud enough to cut through the entire room, she said, "She's a liar and a disgrace." Everything stopped. Forks clinked against plates. The band fell silent. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I froze. Sienna didn't move. The air in the room became impossibly thick, pressing against my chest. "What the hell are you doing?" My voice was low, shaking with disbelief. Diane's expression was wild, her perfect mask cracking for the first time. "She's been spreading lies," she spat. "Telling stories that aren't true. Trying to destroy this family." I could hear the whispers now, the confusion, the stunned silence stretching across the ballroom. Evelyn looked horrified. My father had gone completely still. And then Sienna reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and pressed a button. A voice, cold and familiar, filled the air. It was never supposed to come out. "You think Thomas would stay if he knew? He'd leave in a heartbeat. And you think Caroline could ever forgive me? Never. But I don't care. What's done is done. He was never supposed to find out. A collective gasp swept through the guests. My father turned pale. Diane's eyes widened in horror. Turn that off, she shrieked, lunging toward Sienna, but Sienna stepped back. No, she said, her voice steady. They need to hear this. She hit play again. It's not my fault he fell for me instead. My sister never appreciated him the way I did. It was always supposed to be me. The room felt like it had been stripped of oxygen. My father's voice was barely a whisper. Tell me this isn't true. Diane opened her mouth, but nothing came out. And then I understood. The betrayal. The secret. The reason my mother had always been cold toward me. Because I wasn't supposed to exist. My father's brother, James, had been married to a woman named Lillian. I had vague memories of her, her dark hair, her laugh. But she had left when I was just a child. My father told me she had abandoned the family and no one spoke of her again. Now, I realized the truth. She hadn't left. She had been driven away. Because my mother had said her husband. And I wasn't my father's child. I was James's. The silence in the room was deafening. Diane reached for me, her eyes desperate. Caroline, please, I stepped back. My father turned his face unreadable and walked out of the ballroom. Evelyn sat frozen at the head table, her wedding night now ruined. And I could barely breathe. The life I had known was over. My legs felt unsteady beneath me. The murmur of voices swelled around me, whispers, gasps, the rustling of guests shifting in their seats, unsure whether they should leave or stay and watch the disaster unfold. I saw Evelyn burying her face in her hands, her wedding night unraveling before her eyes. My mother was still standing, frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she were about to protest. But for once in her life, she had no words. My father, Thomas, was already walking away. I could only see the back of his suit as he moved toward the exit, his shoulder squared, but stiff, his gait slow, uncertain. His entire life had just been appended in the space of a few seconds. I wanted to follow him, but my body wouldn't move. Diane took a step toward me, her expression shifting rapidly, anger, desperation, something else, something like fear. Caroline, you have to listen to me, she said, her voice trembling. I backed away. The crowd parted slightly, guests leaning in to watch but pretending they weren't, I starting between us as if they were waiting for the next explosion. Somewhere in the distance, the wedding planner was wringing her hands, whispering frantically to one of the staff members. The servers, who had just begun bringing out dessert, stood motionless, unsure of whether to continue or disappear into the kitchen. I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. You knew, didn't you? My voice was quiet, but I knew she heard me. Diane's expression faltered. Caroline, you knew, I repeated, the words burning my throat. My whole life, you knew. She stopped, her carefully curated mask slipping. It wasn't supposed to matter. The words rang in my head like an off-key note in a symphony. Not supposed to matter. My stomach turned. I glanced at Sienna, who was standing firm, her phone still in her hand, her face carefully blank. But I knew my daughter well enough to see the way her fingers trembled slightly, the way her lips were pressed together and barely contained rage. It wasn't supposed to matter. To whom? To Diane? To my father? To me? My entire childhood flashed before my eyes. Every cold glance, every offhand comment that never made sense at the time. Every time she looked at me like I was something she regretted. I thought about the times I had tried to earn her approval, the way I had fought for scraps of affection, always wondering why I wasn't enough. And now I know. Because I wasn't supposed to exist. Caroline, Diane tried again. Her voice taking on a pleading tone. You have to understand what? I cut her off. My own voice didn't sound like mine. It was thick with something raw, something ugly. That you had an affair with my uncle. That you lied to my father for 40 years. I swallowed, but the lump in my throat refused to go away. Or that I'm nothing but a mistake to you. Diane flinched. The carefully constructed world she had built around herself was crumbling, and I could see it in her eyes, the panic, the struggle to maintain control. This isn't the place, she said, glancing around as if suddenly aware of the dozens of people watching. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Oh, now you care about appearances. I gestured toward Sienna's phone. You didn't seem too concerned about that when you were saying all of that. Her lips pressed together into a thin line. You don't understand the full story, she tried again. Oh. Please, enlighten me, I said, crossing my arms. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty damn clear. My father hadn't returned. He wasn't coming back. Somewhere to my right, Evelyn let out a shaky breath. When I turned to look at her, her face was pale, her eyes glossy. "This was supposed to be my wedding," she said, barely above a whisper. Her voice cracked, her fingers clutching at the white lace of her gown. Guilt twisted in my stomach. This wasn't her fault. None of this was her fault. But the damage was already done. Diane turned sharply towards Sienna, her expression hardening. "Where did you get that recording?" I stiffened. "Don't you dare turn this on her." Sienna didn't waver. "You left your phone on the counter last week. You were on the patio, talking to someone, I don't know who. I heard your voice, so I pressed record. I wasn't even trying to catch you in a lie. I just had a feeling." Diane's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Sienna tilted her head. "What I don't understand is why you kept that recording at all. Were you planning to tell someone? Were you planning to tell Grandpa?" Diane's face was drained of color. "You weren't," I said, realizing dawning. "You were trying to blackmail someone. Weren't you?" The room was eerily quiet now. I could hear someone's fork clatter against a plate in the far corner, a muffled cough. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Diane didn't answer. And that told me everything. She hadn't been trying to keep this secret out of guilt. She had been trying to control it. Of course she had. She had built her entire life on control. She controlled my father, she controlled me, she controlled the narrative of our family. But she hadn't expected Sienna. She hadn't expected my daughter, smart, stubborn, unwilling to be manipulated like I had been. Sienna had shattered her perfect world with a single recording. And Diane had no way to fix it. Her lips trembled as she exhaled. Then, finally, she lowered her head, her hands coming up to rub at her temples. "I never wanted it to come out like this," she muttered. My voice was hollow. "Then how did you want it to come out?" No answer. She had never intended for it to come out at all. I should have felt satisfied. I should have felt something close to triumph, watching her struggle to find words, watching her panic in the face of the truth. But all I felt was tired. So incredibly tired. Sienna turned to me then, her voice quiet. "Mom." I looked at her. "Are we staying?" It was the simplest question in the world. I looked back at Diane, then at Evelyn, who was still sitting there, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. I looked at the guests, their eyes darting away as soon as I met their gaze, embarrassed to have witnessed what they had just seen. I looked at the untouched slice of cake on my plate, at the champagne still bubbling in my glass. And then, without saying another word, I reached for my purse. Sienna did the same. Diane's breath hitched. "Caroline," I turned without looking at her. And I walked away. Not toward my father. Not toward Evelyn. But out of that ballroom. Away from the wreckage my mother had created. Away from her. The night air hit my face as I stepped out of Bellevue Manor, the warmth of the ballroom replaced by a crisp breeze rolling in from the nearby harbor. The faint sounds of music and clinking glasses lingered behind me. But I kept walking. My heels clicked against the stone pathway, and beside me, Sienna moved in quiet, steady strides. Neither of us spoke. I had spent my whole life carefully navigating the tangled mess that was my family, dodging my mother's sharp words, sidestepping the invisible expectations, swallowing the resentment that built inside me year after year. But tonight, it had all come to the surface. The lie. The betrayal. The truth about who I really was. And now I had to face the reality of what came next. We reached the parking lot, where a valet was stationed under a bright overhead light. He straightened when he saw us, already reaching for the keys. "Leaving early, ma'am?" he asked politely. I hesitated. Was I leaving early? Or had I just left behind an entire life? Sienna glanced up at me, her phone still gripped tightly in her hand. I could see the way her fingers curled around it, the way her shoulders were still rigid. She wasn't just my daughter, she was my anchor right now. "Yes," I finally answered. "We're leaving." The valet gave a short nod before hurrying off. I turned to Sienna, my voice low. "Are you okay?" She let out a slow breath. I don't know. I couldn't blame her. This wasn't just my family unraveling, it was hers, too. The car pulled up, and I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel before turning to look at her. Her face was still composed. But I could see it, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on her, the way she was holding it all in. I knew that feeling too well. For a few seconds, we just sat there in silence. Then, in a barely audible voice, she asked, "Where are we going?" I didn't know. For the first time in my life, I had no idea what came next. I exhaled and started the engine. "Let's just drive," I said. And so we did. I didn't realize I was crying until we were halfway down the highway, the city lights blurring into streaks through my windshield. Sienna hadn't said much, just stared out the window, watching as the landscape changed from the manicured streets of Charleston to the quiet stretch of road leading toward home. "Mom," she finally said, her voice softer now. I wiped at my face quickly, trying to gather myself. "Yeah." Her fingers traced the edge of her phone screen. "Did you know? Even just a little?" The question sent a sharp pain through my chest. Did I? Looking back, there had always been something off about the way my mother treated me. The way my father had seemed distant at times. The way family gatherings always carried an undercurrent of something unsaid. But I had never allowed myself to put the pieces together. "No," I admitted. "I didn't." Sienna was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice so small I almost didn't hear it, she said, "I'm sorry." I glanced at her sharply. "Sienna, none of this is your fault." "I know," she said, looking down at her lap. "But I still feel like I broke everything." I slowed the car, pulling onto the shoulder of the road before turning to face her fully. "You didn't break anything," I told her firmly. The truth was already there. "You just didn't let them bury it anymore." Her lips pressed together, and for a second, I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just nodded. I reached for her hand and gave it a squeeze before pulling back onto the road. We drove in silence again, but this time, it felt different. When we got home, the house felt eerily still. I flicked on the lights, the familiar space looking strangely foreign after everything that had just happened. Sienna kicked off her shoes and sat down on the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest. I hesitated, standing near the door, unsure of what to do next. My phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. "Dad." My breath hitched. Sienna noticed. "Are you going to answer?" I hesitated for half a second before swiping to pick up. "Dad?" There was a pause. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "Where are you?" I swallowed hard. "Home." Another pause. "Then, I left." The words hung between us, heavy and final. I closed my eyes. "I know." I heard him inhale shakily. "I don't know what to do, Caroline." I turned away from Sienna, gripping the edge of the counter. "Neither do I." For the first time in my life, my father sounded lost. I had spent so many years resenting him for being passive, for letting my mother control everything. But now, hearing the pain in his voice, I realized something. He was just as much a victim of her lies as I was. And now, for the first time, he was free of them. But freedom comes at a cost. And I wasn't sure if either of us was ready to pay it yet. "Do you want to come over?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. I don't know." And for the first time in my life, I didn't have the right words to fix it. So I just said, "Okay." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us suspended in this strange, unfamiliar space. Then he exhaled. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Okay." I hung up and set the phone down. My hands were shaking. Sienna watched me carefully. "Is he okay?" I let out a humorless laugh. "No. But neither are we." She nodded, as if that was the only answer she expected. I sank onto the couch beside her, exhaustion weighing down on me. For the first time in my life, I had no mother. No certainty about where I came from. And yet, for the first time, I felt something else. Something unfamiliar. Something like relief. And I didn't know what to do with it. Not yet. The next few days passed in a haze. The wedding was over, but the fallout had only just begun. My phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from family members, all of them desperate to make sense of what had happened. Some called to check on me, others to dig for gossip. A few, mostly those who had always clung to my mother's influence, tried to guilt me into silence. Evelyn hadn't reached out. I didn't blame her. But my father did. True to his word, he called the next morning, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I didn't sleep," he admitted. I had spent the night the same way, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying my mother's voice over and over again. "I don't know how to process this, Caroline." He sighed heavily. 40 years. 40 goddamn years. "She fooled all of us," I said quietly. He let out a humorless laugh. "No, not all of us. She didn't fool Sienna." I glanced at my daughter, who was curled up on the couch. scrolling through her phone, pretending not to listen. She had always seen my mother for who she really was, something I had spent most of my life trying not to do. I don't know what to do now, he admitted. Neither did I. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let my mother walk away from this and skate. The first move came from Diane, of course. She wasn't the type to retreat quietly. Instead, she went into damage control, weaving a new version of the truth to salvage whatever dignity she had left. According to her, Sienna had misunderstood the recording. It was all taken out of context. I was overreacting. And the worst one, my father already knew. That last life spread fast. I started getting calls from extended family, people I hadn't spoken to in years, questioning me. Are you sure this isn't just a misunderstanding? Maybe you shouldn't have let Sienna play that recording. She's still your mother, Caroline. I ignored them all. Let them believe what they want. I had something better than gossip. I had proof. And I had spent my whole life letting Diane control the narrative. Not anymore. The second move was mine. My father had been hesitant at first. He wanted distance, not confrontation. He wanted time to think. But I knew Diane too well. She wasn't going to stop. She would twist the story, gaslight him into believing it wasn't as bad as it seemed. She'd done it before. So I made sure that wouldn't happen. Sienna and I sat down with my father one evening, and for the first time, I laid everything out. Every cruel remark. Every manipulation. Every quiet moment where she had made me feel like I wasn't enough. I spent my whole life chasing her approval, I admitted, my voice thick. And now I know why I was never going to get it. Sienna reached for my hand. My father sat silently for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. I don't want her to win, he said. She wouldn't. Not this time. The divorce papers arrived a week later. Diane must have lost it when she opened them. My father hadn't just filed for divorce, he had filed with every advantage on his side. The house? High. The savings? Mostly his. The social standing she had clung to for years? Gone. He wasn't going to let her spin her lies anymore. And neither was I. The last move, the final strike, was mine. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was simple. A week after the wedding disaster, I sent an email to every guest who had attended, including the ones who hadn't reached out. I attached the audio file. No explanation. No added commentary. Just the truth. Let Diane talk her way out of that. The fallout was exactly what I expected. People who had always admired her, who had fawned over her, began to distance themselves. Friendships she had cultivated for decades suddenly vanished. The invitation stopped. The charity events where she thrived suddenly didn't include her. And for the first time in her life, Diane wasn't in control. She called me once, just once. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was shaking when I played it back. You don't understand what you've done. Oh, but I did. For the first time in my life, I had taken something from her. Not money. Not status. Power. And she would never get it back. Evelyn reached out a month later. At first, I thought she was angry. But when I answered, her voice was quiet. I don't know how to deal with this, she admitted. I know, I said. A pause. She's still our mother. I didn't answer. Because, for me, she wasn't. Evelyn sighed. Dad wants to talk to you. I think he's trying to figure out where to go from here. Me too. We agreed to meet soon. To talk. To figure things out together. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, Evelyn was still my sister. That hadn't changed. One afternoon, weeks after the wedding, I found Sienna sitting outside on the porch, her eyes thoughtful as she stared out at the street. I sat down next to her. She glanced at me. Do you regret it? I shook my head. No, I said simply. She nodded, satisfied with the answer. For a long time, we sat there in silence. And for the first time in a long time, it was a silence I could live with. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch, Sienna let out a slow breath and leaned against me. The weight of the past still lingered, but it no longer held me down. Somewhere out there, Diane was left to sit in the ruins of the life she had built on lies. And for once, I wasn't the one scrambling to pick up the pieces. I had nothing left to prove to her. And that, I realized, was the real victory.
Good morning, 早安，妈妈们。 借我你那个麦试下。你们收到了这个 Oxford Dictionary Pen 没有啊 ？e-camus 就是上次 Kobe Daddy 跟这个 e-camus 配合，然后开卖的这个 e-camus。就是 e-camus 我自己呢也有买一套给我的孩子，然后呢我也买一套送给